Welcome to the Trouble with Writing podcast, where we chat about the real issues that stop multilingual writers producing effective English and see where we can help. Hi guys. Pretty well, thanks. I have just sent an email to my lot today saying that I was lacking a bit of enthusiasm, but I get a lot of energy from my community group, which is like a group I've started a few months ago. Lots of writers in there, all kinds of different writers and people from all over the world. And we have a lot of fun in a group. And it's just a nice way to get a bit of energy. So I'm feeling a bit rejuvenated after a January, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Pete, do you have a community?
Yeah, I have a small one that I'm building. But what I did want to say was that recently I discovered a local community in Viña del Mar, the city next to where I live, where people go to practice English. So mainly Chileans, but there are also foreigners like myself. I've met people there from Germany, from France. The other day there was a guy from India. And I really like this group. I wanted to share it with everyone because I think this is a big part of learning another language. It's that intercultural exchange. So you're not only learning a language, you're learning a culture. And it really helps to compare and contrast that second language with your first language, because that way your first language acts as a basis and your first culture acts as a basis to then learn the second one. This group is really great. It's a fun way to learn. It's a way that everybody supports themselves. Nobody is judging, right? And yeah, community really is the future of learning. So I really wanted to share that with everyone.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
100% agree on both fronts, the culture and the community, because it's amazing. It's amazing if you can get communities and come together in person. But of course, nowadays with so much more online, it's hard to be motivated to do stuff. Like everyone can learn on Duolingo or on YouTube or something, but they don't. But if you're in a community that's saying, hey, do this, or like, let's do this together, it's so much more motivating and you're more likely to make progress and do it. I find from my own writing, from my own language learning, from everything like that.
I think it's also an extension of the concept of task-based learning, rather than just reading a textbook about English or grammar, having a conversation about culture or music or whatever. You forget that you're learning, but you're absorbing, you're being exposed to the other person's language, English, or reading it. You're intaking, you're speaking freely because you're passionate about a topic or something. It's funny because when we became more isolated during the pandemic, and some of us developed these projects, we hadn't really figured out how to develop community online yet. But now I think we've come to it, right? Maybe as a natural progression of that. I find the same thing, guys, when I'm feeling a little bit disengaged with my teaching, or even a little bit nervous, like, what am I going to teach today? The moment I'm with the other people, the energy, it's like being in the room. It lights you up a lot, right? Energizing.
Good points. High energy. What are we talking about today, guys? What is the topic of today's podcast?
I've got a bunch of questions that people have asked, and I think you guys have some questions too that we've collected. So it's a kind of a Q&A day, isn't it?
Sounds good to me. Yeah, we've always got loads of questions that I get asked and I want your opinions on, and I'm sure you do too. So that's great. And thanks to any of the listeners out there who sent in some questions. Looking forward to chatting about them and hopefully helping.
And if you have any further questions, just drop them in the comments, sorry, Paul, as we can always, I'm sure we're going to do this again. So yeah, keep those questions coming.
Why don't we kick it off with a question from Pilar Guerrero, and she asks, in what ways do we communicate authority through language? Only through research and consistent publications on the same topic? Or are there more ways to communicate authority through the use of language? What do you think about this topic, guys? Authority in the language you use.
I love this question. So the thing is that authority is linked to your ideas, right? And your ideas are linked to vocabulary. So, one tip is, really focus on building your topic vocabulary. So on topics that you're an expert in. Remember that ideas are linked to content vocabulary, right? So nouns, verbs, and adjectives. The second point here, I love the way that Pilar has said, communicate authority through the use of language. So keyword there is communicate. So this is about being very, very clear with your message. So, and obviously this could be a podcast episode in itself, right? But just briefly, be specific, right? So don't be abstract, use specific words instead of abstract words. Be direct, right? Don't beat around the bush. Don't have, very, very long clauses to set the context before you get to your main idea. Just jump straight in. Keep it simple, right? So don't use, very, very formal or specialized language that could be a barrier to getting your message across. Use plain language. What else would you add, guys? Anything else to that one?
Paul, what do you reckon?
Well, it's an interesting question to me because actually just last evening, I was working with a university student, who's been asked to write an essay about, as a reaction to William Zissner's famous idea that we should always strive for simplicity in language. I can't remember what text he said that, but it's a common refrain. So my student was asked to write an essay for his class, arguing the opposite, arguing for the superiority of complex and sophisticated language, which he doesn't agree with, but it's an exercise in entertaining the opposing view. And as we're working on his essay, we're helping him develop his argument and his ideas and his reasoning, but also encouraging him to use such language in the actual argument. So he's using all this complex verbose language to argue for its superiority. And one of the things he came up with was the exact thing, Pete, you're saying, is that authority and credibility, in other words, encouraging the reader to trust what you say and believe what you say so that you can convince them. He's trying to argue that it comes from using the most specific word, even if it's sophisticated and, 6 syllables. And it's a really interesting process to watch this young student entertaining this argument. And it made me sort of weigh both sides too as I'm helping him. But personally, I favor simplistic language, even with academic topics, if you can, until you get to such point where one word really expresses some kind of idea the only way it can. Then you have no option to use that word. One of the arguments he came up with is that if you can find one word that expresses a complex idea, you could eliminate an entire sentence that's required to explain it and therefore make the writing more concise. So sometimes judicious use of one fancy word can cut a bunch of other words that you don't need. So it's very interesting to watch.
If the audience understands it, right?
Of course, yeah.
That's the thing.
But I think there's validity in both sides, depending on the context and the audience, as you say, Pete, and the purpose of the writing. Because the idea of authority is you want that person to trust your ideas and hopefully be convinced by them. And they won't.
That's why the question is communicate authority. Right?
Exactly. It doesn't have to be spoken explicitly. It can be communicated implicitly through the writing process. But yeah, it's interesting, timely question. How about you, Phil? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think authority is a bit of a problematic word. It's growing in its problem causing, and it's a word that I've used quite a lot to like market myself and talk about my services, like, you know, I'll help you build authority. And I guess to me it meant help people see the value in your writing and your work. That for me is what authority means. But one, it's quite subjective what authority is, and two, I think it depends on the type of writing you're doing. So how, in answer to Pilar's question, how you use language to build authority when you're writing on social media is very different to when you're writing an academic essay. So are we just back to authority means good writing? Because we're saying the usual things of like concision and, you know, use specific words. I'd say on social media, being authority to me means, people trust what you say. And I suppose it's being persuasive. So a lot of the principles are like copywriting principles, but not using the BS subjective copywriting words of, you know, like, oh, I've got a great offer. And it's like, well, why is it great? You have to prove that. And there's other things like using imperatives or using sentence fragments or being super concise in a deliberate way that I think shows readers that you don't have to explain things in full because you're such an authority. So I think that's one way. But then if you talk about journalistic writing or academic writing, another type of writing, I think you prove your authority through using more evidence and arguments which are finely tailored. So yeah, a couple of different points there, but I think it's a great question. I hope we answered it in some way.
I think also, just to sum up the question, it's an important question to ask because there is a lot of communication out there that strikes us as authoritative, but may or may not have any validity behind it. You know, and this is how disinformation or even psychological operations in espionage work. By just seeming to be authority, you can convince somebody of anything. So it's a powerful idea, this idea of credibility and authority, and the way language can be manipulated to convey it, even when it's nonsense. It's one of the great dangers we face nowadays, I think. So great question, Pilar. The next one, guys, and I'll just continue emceeing the question list if you don't mind, comes from Karin Sodzik, maybe? Sodzik? Hopefully I'm not butchering the pronunciation. Karin asks us, if I want to use a synonym, for example, flabbergasted, instead of surprised, how do I know if it's still commonly used by native speakers or if it's outdated or sounds odd? Love this question. What do you think about that? Synonyms. How do you know if synonyms are still culturally valid or appropriate to use?
There's a couple of points I would make. I mean, the first thing is a dictionary can be very handy here, right? So dictionaries can tell you if a word is specialized, if it's old use or archaic, right? If it's formal, if it's low frequency, right? And generally speaking, those words you want to use with caution, right? So, I mean, for example, you know, a word that would be an old use would be something like to talk about a person as fair to mean beautiful, right? That would be like old use, yeah. The second point I would make is that this question is about not sounding or about sounding natural, right? reading and writing together, right? So in the same way as listening and speaking, how do people, when they learn to speak a second language, how do they sound more natural? It's by speaking to native speakers, right? So you listen, you pick things up, you get the accent, you pick up, the vocabulary of the time, right? And it works the same with reading and writing. So when you're reading, you're going to pick up words that are still in use. So you're going to avoid all the old language, like the archaic, old-fashioned. We talked about idioms before, the idioms that are overused, that become cliche. So always link reading with writing. That's the way that you notice, you build vocabulary that is in use, right? And that way you can sound more natural, avoid any outdated words. I hope that answers the question in some way.
Yeah, for me, there's no easy way to do that. It's like expert level language use. There's a couple of tools you can use. I was thinking of One Look Thesaurus, which is a thesaurus that allows you to rank words in certain ways. So I just brought it up here and typed in sporadically, and there are lots of synonyms. It's got 100 plus synonyms for sporadically, and you can sort them from A to Z, most modern, oldest, most formal, funny sounding, lyrical, shortest, longest. It's a really useful tool. It's not 100% reliable, but as a baseline for like, oh, I'm looking for a synonym for this word. Is it more or less formal? Is it older or newer? That's helpful. You can also do more homework on something like COCA, the corpus of, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's the Contemporary English American Corpus. It's COCA anyway, COCA, and that gives you more information about where certain examples come from. So if it's mostly appearing in like 19th century literature, then you know it's old. But yeah, it's just examples, isn't it? It's like if you can Google or find through other means examples of use of a pair of words, for example, you can see the level of like formality and where it has been used. So I guess pay attention to where and try and find examples of use as well, several examples of use.
I think also one of the challenges in doing this is how quickly language evolves and shifts, right? For example, a dictionary might point out something is Old English, OLDE, but it may not indicate whether it's English from the 1930s or the 1970s or the 1990s or 2000s. Language shifts so fast. And if you're picking up language, particularly vocabulary from movies, let's say, I think it's worthwhile to pay attention to when the movie was made, what time period the story is set in, and the same thing with books. If you're reading novels or nonfiction, pay attention to when it was published. And if it's a novel, what time frame the story is set in. Because you might read the book today in 2024 and see flabbergasted. But if the story is set in the 1950s, chances are the writer is trying to capture 1950s expressions, and no one in their right mind would use that nowadays. But I think it is a higher order challenge for a language learner or a writer, and use those words with caution. That you don't necessarily have to use them. Nothing wrong with the word surprised, right? But it's a challenge if you're learning a language or using a language out of the language context. If you're not, for example, using English in the UK or Canada or the US, you're not going to have the access to the contemporary lexicon zeitgeist. You're not going to be exposed to what's being used and what's not being used. And you might end up using an archaic expression, ironically, right? If you use a term from the 1930s with your 2024 audience, they might assume you're being ironic and silly, trying to raise the dead expression, so to speak. I think
some
it's a fascinating
dictionaries
question.
tell you this too. Right? So in some dictionaries, they tell you, if you look up the word wench, so wench means young woman, right? It's old use. But if you look it up in the dictionary, it'll also say humoristically, so, or ironically, or something like this. So, But I was just going to, kind of summarize my main point on this. I would always tell journalists, learning to write in English as a second language, your main bulk of reading should be reading today's journalism in English, reputable publications. And that's how you're going to develop your voice. It's how you're going to use language in a natural way. So that would be my main focus.
Great. Gents, I have a question here from Monica Machera. And she's asking us, most freelancers have to ghostwrite blog posts, threads, or ebooks. From a teacher's perspective, what specific grammar or techniques do you guys tell your students to use in capturing the individual brand or company's voice in the actual writing process? So this sounds like it's related to copywriting, but maybe not. What do you think about this? What grammar or techniques do you tell your students to use in a way, as a means of capturing the brand or the company's voice?
It relates to content writing or any kind of ghostwriting, really. We were talking about this in my community the other day about tips to capture people's voices. And if you can, get on the phone with your clients and listen to the way that they speak. So some of it, if you're writing a post on behalf of a CEO, for example, like ghostwriting a newsletter, it's good to capture the way they speak in terms of their dialogue. So knowing a little bit more about the way that we write dialogue in fiction is helpful, the way it's formatted, the kind of things that we do and don't say, because fiction dialogue is really what is said, as opposed to, if you're a newer fiction writer, you might say, oh, look over here, or I've just found a key to a treasure chest. It's no one would actually say that out loud.
Mm-hmm.
All of these things where people speak at the same time or sort of speak to themselves. It doesn't happen so much in real life. But yeah, that's the point, is dialogue, try and capture the expressions that are used, the kind of contractions, the kind of manner in which people speak. I think that's one tip. Other grammatical things to look at, or linguistic things, I'd say, is look at pronoun use. How is this personal company, are they addressing the reader? Are they using first person plural? Are they making it quite impersonal and not mentioning themselves? That's one key aspect of voice, I think. I guess it depends. A lot of companies adopt a very safe business style voice, where they just try and take all personality out of it and keep it very objective. Maybe that's changing now. Monica, maybe you're talking about capturing the voice of a specific person that you're writing for. I think Monica writes books, ghostwrites books. So, I'd go back to that, looking at all of your communications with this person, the client, listening to what they say, and maybe considering their culture as well, because some of the kinds of references that, and analogies and metaphors and similes that people use are related to their culture. So I think that's important in capturing someone's voice.
Any thoughts on that, Pete?
I like when Phil talked about studying the way that the company uses language, right? So you can look at the register. Are they using more formal words, less formal words? Are they using jargon, right? Yeah, so definitely study the pieces written by the company to try to get a sense of that voice. Yeah.
I wonder also, do you think it depends how prominently figured the company representatives are? Like, is there a Steve Jobs whose character represents the company, or is it a company that has a logo or a brand and less of a personality forward? Like, I don't know, can't think of a company like General Electric, GE. Nobody knows who the CEO is, but everyone knows who was the CEO of Apple, right? So maybe if you have a personality that's who represents the brand, maybe it's a little easier to pick up some of their linguistic style and even grammar based on interviews and, you know, their public persona. And maybe the copy and the content that results from that's produced by that company should reflect that, or maybe not. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Depending on if there's a personality, a visible personality to a company or a brand. Does that make any impact?
Yeah, it's difficult to know how to answer this without getting a bit more information on what Monica is writing, I guess. But for me, it's always about reverse engineering content, reverse engineering writing. So what the writing that you find, whether it's from a company and individual conversations that you've had, reverse engineer it in terms of sentence structures, length, like Pete says, formality, register, what kind of words they're using. And as I said, things like pronoun use and how they're addressing readers or listeners.
And remember tone too, right? So, is it serious sounding? Is it humorous? Right? Think about tone too.
Mm-hmm. That might be related to the product of the company itself, right? What are they selling? Something that's naturally inclined towards comfort and humorous tone, or is it deadly serious in nature? I think would you say that all those things are kind of addressed when you are hired for such a job? Do they give you some sense of what's expected in tone or formality?
From my dealings with ghostwriters, that's something that, there may be courses or coaches out there who go into this in more detail, but I think company-wise, it's not really taught and people don't get very much help. They get hired of like, oh, can you write from the perspective of this brand or company? And they're just sort of told yes or no. Yes, that's right. Or no, that's not good. And that's where people get stuck because they're not getting actual advice on like, well, how do you do that? That's why we're getting these questions, right. I guess.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay. Maybe it's related to that question to a degree. Sorry, Pete?
No, so I was just adding that.
Pete, go ahead.
I think you're expected to. Can you hear me? Yeah. You're expected to study the work by that company or that person, and that, as Phil said, that's why we have, that question was asked, right? Because as it sounds.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next one?
Okay. Moving to our next question. Yeah, this one's maybe somewhat related, but Walter M. writes us saying, I want to start a blog and write about my city's neighborhoods. Is it possible to still build an audience with a blog and make money nowadays? What do you think about blogging, guys?
Yeah, it seems like a bit almost like an outdated term because when we think about blogging, that was like Internet 1.0. It's like a personal page of writing about my life and my neighborhood. I think now it's transformed into a way to get traffic. So in the last 10 years, SEO gurus have figured out how to get pages to rank on Google, and that's the way that you get people to your company, by writing lots of these pages, and Google will say, yes, this is a good website to send people to when they type in search queries. Can you build an audience through a blog? I think if you're doing it that way, you have to be an SEO expert. And there are a lot of people I know that do that start blogs, that have writers that attempt to get ranked and then monetize that blog. I think it's, if you're talking about building like an audience just for your writing, there's probably easier ways that you can do that via social media, communities that you join, and platforms like Medium, which is a good middle ground between blogging and, discovering everyone else's work. That's my
I'd
two
say,
cents.
I would say maybe rather than blogging, you should think about a newsletter, right? So Phil mentioned Medium. There's also a LinkedIn newsletter. There's Substack. There's a whole array of newsletters. And before thinking about making money, so before thinking about monetizing, maybe think about the benefits of what you mentioned, Phil, building an audience. Just on LinkedIn. So I think obviously a lot of our audience is on LinkedIn, and just a LinkedIn newsletter without thinking about monetizing or anything is a great way to gain visibility, right? So you have your newsletter, and straight away your people can sign up, and then every time you publish an article, it's in everybody's notifications, or your connections get a notification that you've published an article. And also, having a newsletter means that you can always, when you pitch one of your articles, you can always add links to your work. So it's a good way to build a portfolio.
That's a good point. Just to jump in on that, Pete, much of the advice nowadays is to syndicate where you publish your writing. So you can host it on your blog and have a website where you publish your original writings. And then, there's nothing stopping you also having a Substack newsletter and publishing on Medium and LinkedIn and using that content elsewhere. Again, I'm not an expert on how to get traffic to your blog, but certainly if you write some great articles, then you can use those in many places and interact with people in different ways to get them to be interested. But I'd also say, if it's related to where you live in a neighborhood, is go for where the audience already is, because that's hard to get people to come to you. It's hey, I've got a newsletter about Gran Canaria. Well, it's I need to go to where that audience is and publish in places where they're already hanging out and they're already interested.
Thinking of the idea of Internet 1.0, there was a time where if you wanted to read something related to, I don't know, a specific neighborhood, you'd type that in, and you might see 2 or 3 websites with material based on that. But now you're going to get millions. Even if you, and this has just been my experience, even if you completely optimize your SEO and use all the right words to target your audience and niche, when they search those words, they're going to get an absolute tsunami of responses that are using those same words. There's just so much material now compared to 20 years ago. And it can be daunting to someone starting a blog or any kind of internet writing. So I think what you've suggested here is kind of focusing on 1 or 2 platforms where your audience already is, or it limits how many people are sharing similar things. Like on Medium, if you search a topic, you're going to get several articles, and then the topic starts to get a little more removed in nature. It's not like searching for something on Google. It's like, that's an ocean of content. And I'm old enough to have seen that process, right? Where I remember when I had my first internet access, I would surf websites. You'd go from website to website based on links and content topics. And all of that is completely gone now. So there's just, I wonder if it's worthwhile to start a blog. I don't know if the form itself is SEO valid anymore. So I like the ideas you're presenting of posting on LinkedIn or Medium, a specific platform where there's a large enough audience and specific enough that may turn into a following.
I guess it goes back to like, what's your objective and why would people read it? You have to think that about all writing that you're doing, not just for yourself. If you want to keep a diary and a blog and something that may turn into a book project or something for yourself in the future, that's fine. But you don't expect, people to find you, because the internet is an ocean, as you said. I think if you have a specific goal of like, this is why people will be interested and this is what I'm going to deliver, that may have some value down the line, but it's very, very challenging to say, hey, I'm going to launch a blog about in my city and make money from it. That's, maybe if you had that idea 20 years ago, but now it's that real estate has been eaten up.
Yeah, truly.
So you
even if you had
that's why we talk about personal writing and like having opinions and having a voice and like something different, that people want to know what you think about your city.
And that maybe lends itself to developing an online presence and authority as someone worth listening to, right? So putting yourself forward in addition to your writing. Sorry, Pete, I cut you off there. Go ahead, please.
No worries. No, I was just gonna add that on a very basic level, you right? So it can be a good way to overcome any right? If you're new to writing as a second language, then starting a blog is a good way to overcome that initial anxiety about, oh my God, can I even write in English as a second language? Are people going to judge me? Or you have all these mindset issues.
So one of our friends, Jürgen Winter, asks, can you show me a couple of real life use cases of the Hemingway app that can help me earn back the $20? I assume the $20 is the price of the Hemingway app.
Yeah, I think Jörn is a member of my community, so I remember him asking this question. And you can use Hemingway for free, but I think if you download it and you want it to save the texts that you've put into it and such, then you have to pay $20. And I think Jörn's gripe is that it tells you to simplify everything and make text highly readable. And I would say it depends on what kind of text you're writing. If you are writing texts for social media, then it should be simple. Where are people reading this? If it's on a phone screen, very close to their face, then we need lots of white space and lots of very, very short sentences and the kind of readability that Hemingway tells you to give texts. I think the problem is it doesn't say why. It just says, oh, hey, it's this sentence is long. It's like, well, so what? It might be good to have it there. It might not be. So I would first and foremost use it as a guide and always ask the question of like, is this my aim to make it shorter or simpler? Also, it's worth looking up readability scores, how they are actually compiled. Most of them, to my understanding, are based on sentence length and word length, and it's words in terms of their syllable length. So that's something to keep an eye on if you're looking to hit a readability target for a blog that you're writing for, your company or whatever, then it's often quickest to attack words which are longer in syllables and see if you can downgrade them. It doesn't necessarily make it easier to read in terms of the level that is required to know a word. So that's something to think about. And just consider, again, what type of writing you're doing. If you're writing academic text or text for a more weighty, authoritative publication, then the goal shouldn't be just to get a particular score from Hemingway. The goal should be to communicate in the best way possible, and that's often using longer words and sentences. So I definitely understand Jörn's frustration. I think it also stems, just final word on this, Paul, before I let you chip in, is it stems from this simplistic advice that we see online of like, oh, use Hemingway, mate, run everything through this one tool that will give you great readability. Everyone will love it. It's not good advice. So that's my
welcome back, Pete.
Thoughts.
Pete, do you have anything to add on the Hemingway question, the Hemingway app? Have you used it?
No, it looks like Pete is on mute at the moment. Hopefully he'll be back soon. We're back, yeah.
Pete, any thoughts on the Hemingway question? It looks frozen now.
It's always the issue. The last to the party on Restream gets choppy.
Hopefully he's not experiencing an earthquake in Chile,
Let's hope
disrupting the internet. I went through 2 earthquakes when I was in Japan last month. I have a question for you about the Hemingway app. If it's giving you the advice based on the length of the sentence and the word, this is maybe also something I would caution my writers to think about. Is it focusing on whatever you input, or is it looking at words and sentences in isolation? Does it kind of calculate? I don't know what I'm saying, but if you put 2 sentences or 3 in, it's just sort of counting the length of
each sentence. So the readability score is based on overall in your text. If it's 400 words or 4,000, the average sentence length and average syllable length of a word, and then there's a calculation done which will say you got 20 or 50 or 70 or a particular score. I mean, my thought on it is that, and this applies to all writing aids, Pro Writing Aid and Grammarly, and even not so much generative AI, but any thing which is giving you advice. It's advice. Like, the problem with Grammarly is people see red underlining their words and they think it's wrong, so they just want to get rid of the red. Oh, I don't like being wrong. They lose confidence. And it's kind of the same with Hemingway. It's like, we see all this long sentence. Oh, that's a long sentence. Oh, your readability score is too low. And you think, oh, I have to change it. You don't have to change it. The key as an expert writer is like identifying whether it should be changed or not. And these tools are really useful at highlighting things, but just see them as that. Like it's bringing something up and going, hey, think about this. It's not saying change it.
I would also add that, and this is something I think we talked about in an earlier episode about style. As a writer, your concern isn't just that sentence and achieving the average sentence length an app tells you. Your job as the writer is to consider your sentence, your word, and your sentence in the context of all the other sentences. And I like to think of sentences like shots in a movie. They exist in juxtaposition to whatever comes before it and whatever comes after it. So if you have a long sentence and Hemingway tells you to shorten it, okay, fair enough. But what if the next sentence after it is also short? and the next one after it is short. You may have benefited from the longer sentence you originally input, followed by two shorties, because it creates a nice rhythm rather than a monotonous beat-like hypnotic rhythm. So I think, it's helpful perhaps, but also you have to look at your writing as a whole and how it feels in relation to the other sentences and ideas and words you're using. You may want to sprinkle in with really simplistic vocabulary. You may want to drop in a larger multisyllabic word for emphasis because it will stand out. That may be something you want for effect. So that's my concern with these kind of apps. They're sort of calculating things isolated from maybe even your intentions. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so you're the writer. Can you hear me, by the way? Sorry about this. Yeah. So you're the writer, and the apps are your assistants, right? So don't rely on the app. You have to use your own judgment, and the app is there to support you.
That's a great place to end because, as always, we're in support of the writer, not the machine. So, great piece of advice to conclude, Pete. You're the writer. I love it.
Thanks for all of your questions, everyone. And I think there's one or two questions we didn't get to, so we will try and reach out to you and answer those, or maybe we'll save them for a future episode of Q&A on the trouble with writing. So yeah, it's been a pleasure as always, gents, to chat.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up for today.
Yeah.
You betcha.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, guys. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.